Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to Jamestown Settlement. I'm Sally Meyer, the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. It is a pleasure to have you all here this evening for what is sure to be a wonderful program. The opportunity to partner with Preservation Virginia and others to put together this series has been an exciting one, knowing that 2026 is not just the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but also the 350th of Bacon's Rebellion. I hope you will join us again on May 13th at Bacon's Castle for women's perspectives on Bacon's Rebellion, with a standout panel of presenters from Preservation Virginia, Jamestown Rediscovery, Kina Consulting, William & Mary, and the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Thank you again for being here, and in a moment I'll turn it over to Elise Whirling, Director of Collections and Interpretation for Preservation Virginia, and the mastermind behind this program series. Also would love you all to fill out the evals that some of you got as you came in. There's some more on the table back there. Let us know what kinds of programs you're interested in and want to come back for. Turn it over to you, Elise.
Alrighty. Thank you, Sally. Let's see. First, on behalf of Preservation Virginia, I want to extend the gratitude of myself and my colleagues to our great colleagues here at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation for partnering with us on this year-long programming initiative and for hosting us here tonight. As Sally mentioned, we have an exciting lecture series happening this year, and I invite you to check out the full slate of events at www.baconsrebellion350.org. The multi-organization initiative has been in the works for over a year now with a group of dedicated professionals and tribal representatives. These organizations are Preservation Virginia, which includes Bacon's Castle and Jamestown Rediscovery, Jamestown Settlement, the Pamunkey Indian Tribe, the Rappahannock Indian Tribe, and the Nottoway Indian Tribe, with support from the College of William & Mary and Virginia Humanities. It is very fortuitous tonight that Sally and I are here to welcome to the stage Professor James Rice, as we both hold master's degrees in History and Museum Studies from the very school and department that Professor Rice currently serves at. And so, I am pleased to welcome Professor Jim Rice to the stage tonight. He is the Walter S. Dixon Professor of English and American History at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. A sixth-generation Californian, he holds a PhD and master's degree in American history from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree from Colorado College. Before joining the faculty at Tufts, he taught at a variety of institutions, including SUNY Plattsburgh, Washington College, and Tübingen University. He is the author of Nature and History in the Potomac Country, From Hunter-Gatherers to the Age of Jefferson, and Tales from a Revolution, Bacon's Rebellion and the Transformation of Early America. His scholarship and teaching areas are aimed at breaking down the barriers between what are often treated as separate subjects, between American history and Native American history, between colonial American and prehistory, between the national histories of what are today the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and above all, between history and neighboring disciplines. So without further ado, Dr. Rice.
So thank you for that kind introduction. I was thinking generations of jumbos. But it's really great to be here and to be kicking off this fascinating lecture series and series of programs. As many of you already know, Bacon's Rebellion was a bitter civil war that convulsed the key English colony of Virginia from 1675 to 1677. It's long been considered one of the most significant events in not only early American history, but all of American history. It's a fixture of high school advanced placement courses, university classes, textbooks, and scholarly writing. Although it was generally condemned by 18th century colonists, from the Revolution onward, it came to be regarded as an integral part of the nation's creation story, a status that it retains to this day. The title of this talk is Tales from a Revolution, Bacon's Rebellion and the Transformation of Early America. And I think the key word in that title is tales. I'm going to tell you several tales tonight None of these tells the whole story. In fact, at some points, I'm going to say just barely enough to set up later lectures and programs in this series. Still, at the end, I hope I've added a layer or two to your understanding of this seminal historical event. Specifically, I'm going to tell this story in 3 different ways. First, as an important episode in Virginia and US national history. Second, through a narrative that centers Native American actors. And third, as an Atlantic history that encompasses Eastern North America and Northern Europe. I think we need all 3 of these framings if we're going to understand Bacon's Rebellion's significance, and also to begin to get a handle on the often I have trouble with that phrasing, jaw-dropping behavior of those who participated in it. The story of Bacon's Rebellion, in just about any telling, begins in the summer of 1675 in a trading dispute between the Potomac Valley merchant planter Thomas Matthew, one of my favorite characters in these stories, and a group of Doeg Indians. This dispute came during a rough patch in Virginia's history. It was a moment when many Virginians were frustrated and looking for someone to blame. In recent years, they had experienced a spike in taxes due to the expense of a recent war with the Dutch, while economic conditions, particularly for landless men and small planters, were in rapid decline. The colony's many former indentured servants, that is, people who had contracted to work without pay for a term of years in exchange for transportation to the colony, had had it especially hard. The conflict between Thomas Matthew and the Doegs led to a series of retaliatory killings, culminating in the accidental murder of 14 Susquehannock Indians by Virginia militia officers who mistook the Susquehannocks for Doegs. From there, matters escalated into a general war with the Susquehannocks. And in fact, one recent scholar has kind of reframed Bacon's Rebellion as not so much a rebellion as an outgrowth of the Susquehannock War. The following spring, a difference of opinion among colonists about how best to conduct this war against the Susquehannocks escalated into a civil war between forces led by the elderly William Barclay, governor of Virginia since 1641, and the young rebel, a recently arrived James River planter named Nathaniel Bacon. Governor Barclay wanted to avoid war with what were called neighbor Indians, the Pamunkeys and others who lived in close proximity to the colonists, while at the same time prosecuting the Susquehannock War. I should add that Barclay wasn't sort of pro-Indian. He had a long-term vision that for Virginia that did not include Native people, but he also had to balance the books and wanted to avoid a general war. Bacon, on the other hand, and his followers, they blamed Indians as a whole for many of their problems. And they thought that Barclay's policies coddled Indians, a term that comes up a lot, coddled, at the expense of English colonists. Are not the Indians all of a color? Asked the Baconites. The common cry was, away with these distractions. We will have war with all Indians. We will spare none. Bacon and his followers regarded the Susquehannock War as an opportunity to wage this general war and to resolve all of their problems with Indians, and by extension, many of their problems, period, at one stroke. I'm going to read here, because sometimes I got it right when I wrote something. So imagine this scene not far upriver from here. There are sort of drum beats in the woods. Small groups of people calling themselves volunteers are gathering, looking for a leader and looking for permission from the governor and his council to go out against the Indians in general. So some of these volunteers are massed in Charles City County at Jordan's Point, for those of you who are local enough to know where that is. Elizabeth and Nathaniel Bacon entertained guests at Curl's plantation. Captain James Cruz, a close friend and neighbor, was there. Bacon's fur trading partner, William Byrd, and Henry Isham, a Charles County planter whose estate, Doggums, lay nearby, were there. As the liquor flowed, the 4 men lamented, and this is a quote, the sadness of the times and the fear they all lived in. As they reached a height of drinking, also a quote, Cruz suggested that they all go over and see the soldiers. on the other side James River and to take a quantity of rum with them to give the men to drink. Cruz, Isham, and Bird, it turned out, notice I named everyone except Bacon, these other three men had already, quote, laid the plot with the soldiers at Jordan's Point. The volunteers were waiting. They gathered around Bacon and all at once shouted and cried out, "A Bacon, a Bacon," and begged him to lead them against the Indians. Cruz, Isham, and Bird egged him on, swearing that they would, quote, drink damnation to their souls to be true to him, whether or not he secured a commission, so long as they could take revenge against the Indians. Bacon had in effect been rehearsing his acceptance speech for months in bitter conversations about the savagery of the Indians, as he put it, the uselessness of the forts that Governor Barclay wished to have erected on the frontier, the waste of tax money that would go into those forts, and the governor's friendship, as he saw it, toward the Indians and his small circle of favorites among the colonists. Now Bacon encouraged the tumult. A large paper was produced upon which Bacon wrote his followers' names, circular-wise, that their ringleaders might not be found out. Afterward, it seemed as if Bacon must have had some magic at his disposal to have convinced his men to take such a dangerous step, some charm by which he, quote, conjured them into this circle and bound them by an oath to stick fast together. If so, the charm held. Bacon crossed the James again to New Kent, a county ripe for rebellion, as he put it, to recruit more followers. Within days, he had a force of 300 armed men at his disposal, prepared to go out forth against the Indians. Well, Barclay didn't like this. Barclay was the governor. Barclay would decide when to wage war and who would wage it. A flurry of increasingly hostile letters between the governor and the rebel followed all through March and into actually all the way into May. Eventually, Barclay had had enough. He declared Bacon to be in mutiny and set out up the James River with several hundred horsemen to capture him. The governor just missed the rebel. By then, Bacon and the volunteers were riding southward, headed to the Roanoke River, where they heard there were Susquehannocks. Instead, though, they attacked the Occaneechees, trading partners of the colony, who had since mid-century been an important link in a burgeoning trade in deerskins and Indian slaves. And I want to bookmark that idea, burgeoning trade in not just deerskins, but enslaved Indians. Despite this alliance with the Occaneechees, the Virginians killed over 100 of them in a sneak attack, laid waste to their main town, and sent the survivors fleeing into exile into what is today North Carolina. Afterwards, Barclay declared Bacon a rebel and forced him to submit during a provincial assembly at Jamestown in June 1676. Bacon was there, having been elected to the assembly, albeit at the point of 40 of his men's guns at the election place. Bacon escaped Jamestown after submitting, then returned a few days later at the head of a volunteer army. With 400 men at his back, Bacon demanded a military commission to attack native people. It went something like this. The main body of Bacon's horsemen and foot soldiers arrived the next afternoon. Most assembled on the green near the State House, while others, quote, possessed themselves of all the avenues, disarming all in town. They intercepted men on their way to defend the governor and burgesses, preventing reinforcements. Drums began to beat, the signal for the burgesses to gather in their third-floor chamber. Barclay closeted himself with the council on the second floor. Drawing some of his men up, quote, to the very door and windows of the State House, end quote, Bacon loudly demanded a commission as commander of Virginia's forces against the Indians. There's the governor, and there's the scene that I'm describing. The burgesses reminded Bacon that they, not Bacon's army, had been elected to legislate for the colony, and they insisted that, quote, they had taken all possible care for carrying on the Indian war at the easiest charge, that is, at the least expense that could be. The new bills addressed all of their constituents' complaints, they said, and the burgesses, quote, desired that for satisfaction of the people, what they had done might be publicly read. Then as now, a bill has to be read aloud. It's part of the process of passing the bill. Bacon's reply, "There shall be no bills read." The governor had had enough. Followed by his counselors, Berkeley erupted from the State House door, calling Bacon a rebel and a traitor. Unbuttoning his shirt front, the apoplectic governor bared his breast. "Here, shoot me, for God, fair mark, shoot," he cried repeatedly. "God damn his blood, I came for a commission, and a commission I will have," swore Bacon. Burgesses crowding the windows of their upstairs chamber saw Bacon, as Matthew wrote, strutting betwixt two files of men with his left hand on his hip and flinging his right arm every way. Matthew clattered downstairs to join the gathering crowd, sticking with some sailors that were in town for safety. After several minutes, Berkeley huffed off towards his townhouse at the other end of State House Row, followed by his counselors. An animated, furious Bacon turned out to his men and ordered them to ready their weapons, then trailed after Berkeley with a detachment of soldiers. Behind them, Bacon's men cocked their guns and took aim at the Burgesses, who were crowding the State House windows, repeating with menacing voices, "We will have it. We will have it," that is, the commission. Bacon had instructed them to fire if he signaled them by drawing his sword, and as Matthew watched nervously, Bacon followed Berkeley in what he called a paroxysm of frenetic fury, and the rebel leader was repeatedly grasping the hilt of his sword, which, of course, if he'd unsheathed it, that would have been the result for the signal for a massacre. Bacon was delirious, and he was heard to say, "Damn my blood, I'll kill governor, council, assembly, and all, and then I'll sheath my sword in my own heart's blood." So eventually one of the Burgesses cracked. He shook out his handkerchief and waved it out the window while crying over and over again, "You shall have it, you shall have it." Bacon's volunteers lowered their guns. What Matthew called this Pacific handkercher also calmed Bacon, who led his detachment back to the main body of the army on the nearby green. Berkeley, though, was still furious. He insisted that he would rather die than give Bacon a commission. But no one else felt quite so strongly. Under heavy pressure from the council, Berkeley reluctantly agreed to sign one. So, to summarize the struggle that ensued between the rebels and the loyalists, while leaving out a lot, in July, the rebels attacked Jamestown directly. Berkeley fled temporarily to the eastern shore, not for the last time, because Jamestown repeatedly changed hands in the summer of 1676, and in fact was burned to the ground by retreating rebel troops in September. Bacon died in October of disease, more about that later. His followers fought on until mid-January, when the last of them were captured or simply went home. The story typically ends with the January 1677 arrival of royal commissioners who had been sent along with 1,000 regular British troops to investigate the matter. Their investigation culminated in Governor Berkeley's disgrace and his removal to London. Berkeley died there in July without ever having the opportunity to tell his side of the story to the king. His wife's last letter to him, written from Jamestown, was dated, I think, 33 days after his death. So, scenes like the ones that I've just read to you, plus quite a few others that I haven't, lend themselves very handily to a narrative that centers on the struggle between the governor and the rebel, beginning with Nathaniel Bacon's arrival in Virginia in 1674 and ending with the governor's death in 1677. This is narrative 101, folks. You've got a ready-made conflict here between a protagonist and an antagonist, and a ready-made story arc with a beginning, a middle, and the end. Bacon's rebellion also fits handily into broad brush accounts of American history, and in fact it has often been presented as a founding moment in the story of the United States, despite the fact that the Declaration of Independence was still a century away. In his 1940 Torchbearer of the Revolution, for example, Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker wrote that the rebellion was fought over the question of, quote, whether the mass of people were to control the government, or whether there was to be a degraded peasantry held under the heel of the mother country. Berkeley, he wrote, was the, quote, arch enemy of American democracy, while Bacon, the true 17th century patriot, gave his life in the cause of American democracy. In other words, this was a precursor to the American Revolution, a premature revolt against British tyranny that in the end represented just a temporary setback for the unstoppable cause of American liberty. Edmund S. Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, The Ordeal of Colonial Virginia, came out in 1975. This was obviously a very different time from Wharton Baker's 1940, and Morgan offered a correspondingly different explanation of Bacon's rebellion and its importance in American history. 1676, Morgan said, was the pivotal moment in a long process in which history came to be in which slavery came to be baked into American society. For Morgan, Bacon's rebellion was what he called an instinctive attempt to subdue class conflict by racism. Frightened by the rebellion, in its wake, he wrote, Virginia's ruling class replaced most white indentured servants with slaves and co-opted poor whites by offering them better economic opportunities and more political power than they had previously had. In other words, ordinary white Virginians henceforth enjoyed greater liberty precisely because enslaved Africans had practically none. In case you're wondering, modern historians find Morgan's account of Bacon's rebellion far more convincing than Wharton Baker's. I'd say it's 51 years after its publication, and I think it still is the most influential interpretation we have. Well, although Wharton Baker's and Morgan's portrayals of Bacon's rebellion could hardly have been more different, both tended to view it as a contest between East and West, between elites and common folks, plus, in Wharton Baker's definition, between democracy and monarchy. And yet, there are real problems with this way of breaking down who joined the rebellion and who lined up behind the governor. To begin with, Wharton Baker's democracy versus monarchy narrative is plainly contrary to the evidence. Bacon insisted vociferously, repeatedly, that he was acting on behalf of the king against a governor who was the real traitor to the crown's interests. And as one of Wharton Baker's first critics wrote, should a democratic champion of the oppressed limit his benevolence to whites only? This East-West thing also doesn't quite map onto the evidence. There are too many people in the East, Jamestown, who were active rebels, and there are too many people in the West who were active loyalists. There are too many people in the North, this other frontier of Virginia at the time, who were on either side. The distinction between elite loyalists and common folks in rebellion also doesn't add up. Again, they're really, really wealthy planters. Think of how Bacon got roped into leading this rebellion. He was in this room with 4 really rich planters, and they convinced him to lead this rebellion. Some of the men who were hanged or were basically on the run to avoid being hanged at the rebellion were wealthy planters based in Jamestown. There was a prior governor of North Carolina, and so forth. So you can't really just sort things out so easily. Besides, if everyone who was a loyalist was an elite, that would make the kind of the struggle kind of unequal, right? Okay. These 3 notions about who took what side may not square with the evidence, but they keep sticking to the story of Bacon's rebellion. This is probably, I think, because they so neatly fit a deeply grooved template, a deeply grooved narrative template that I think we're all familiar with. In this imagined face-off between Eastern elites and rugged frontier Democrats, you might recognize the basic premise of the classic American Western novel or movie, a premise that was drilled into the American psyche through its repetition in thousands upon thousands of the Westerns that drew crowds to theaters and that filled the bookshelves of recreational readers in the 20th century. And anyway, a lot of this attempt to figure out who was a loyalist and a rebel is aside from the point, because people didn't even fit very neatly into these categories. There weren't 2 sides to this story. It fails to account really for the preference of most people in many conflicts, not just this one, for neutrality, to be left alone, to live their lives. And we can see this at key stages in the rebellion. In Gloucester County, both Bacon and Barclay made direct personal appeals, went to Gloucester County and appealed directly to the people there to line up on their side. And in each case, the people there said, I don't know. The exception being when Bacon's men really extorted them at the point of guns to take his side. So really, a lot of people, including my favorite, Thomas Matthew, kind of wanted to stay out of the way of things. And what about loyalists? Why would someone be a loyalist? What about rebels? Why would someone be a rebel? Are they all there for the same reasons? As I've already hinted, a lot of people chose the side they did because they were coerced, because they felt it was the safest thing to do in the moment, because it was what their neighbors would do. If you stay this program, I see this program through to the end and visit Bacon's castle, you'll learn more about a man who kind of stood out from his neighbors in that he wasn't on Bacon's side, and they used his house really very sorely as a consequence. Okay, so also many people change their minds repeatedly. Some of those reasons could be idiosyncratic. They might have found one side's arguments or another's persuasive or off-putting, or it could be as pragmatic as just tacking back and forth in an attempt to stay on the winning side, which kept changing. Okay, above all, there was a large and varied set of actors out there who can't be crammed into any of these sides. They can't be labeled as loyalists or rebels, elite or poor, rich or poor, elite or common planter. I'm speaking, of course, of Native Americans, which brings me to the second of our three stories about Bacon's Rebellion. In most accounts of Bacon's Rebellion, Native people, having inadvertently triggered an earthquake along some unstable fault line in Virginia society, then stand aside while the colonists duke it out among themselves. Occasionally, a group of Indians, such as the Occaneechees, drops into the story. They serve as a foil for Bacon's men. They suffered at the hands of Bacon's men, and then they drop out of the story. What Native Americans wanted and what they actually did are not typically part of the story. And here I'm going to stay away from a really great future program in this series that's going to be focusing on Dragon Run, and I'm going to speak about pretty much everything but that. I'm going to speak on a broader canvas here. Because the fact is that dozens of First Nations were caught up in the events surrounding Bacon's Rebellion, up and down the eastern seaboard. Native people were at the heart of this conflict. So their stories are critical to understanding the causes, conduct, and the consequences of Bacon's Rebellion. This was an enormously complicated situation, and I can only highlight a few points now. I published an article a while back that's, I think, 5 times the length of this talk. So I'm only going to touch on a few high points here, but here goes. The causes. In their early years, Virginia, established in 1607, and Maryland, established in 1634, were too small and weak to dominate their indigenous neighbors. They slotted themselves instead into the region's pre-existing configurations of alliance, enmity, and trade. Virginia allied itself and entered into a profitable fur trade with the Susquehannocks of the northern Chesapeake. Their homeland lay along the Susquehanna River, while Maryland fell in with the Piscataway Nation, long-standing enemies to the Susquehannocks. When Virginians accidentally attacked a cabin full of Susquehannocks as part of the tit-for-tat trading dispute between Thomas Matthew and the Doegs, Susquehannock leaders, thinking of this now 3-generation-long alliance, expected that Governor Barclay would soon restore peace and would reaffirm this long-standing alliance. But most Virginians felt that the Susquehannock alliance no longer served their interests. So instead, the dust-up spiraled into a full-on war. The Susquehannocks felt a profound sense of betrayal at the hands of their allies. Their correspondingly furious reprisals, mostly in what's now northern Virginia, shocked the colonists, that caused many to abandon their homes and created sufficient fear and panic throughout the colony to generate the popular support that Bacon so badly needed in order to turn the Susquehannock War into a general war against Native people. Kakakoeska, the Werewanska, or hereditary chief of the Pamunkey Nation, understood from the beginning that if Bacon had his way, her people would be scattered and destroyed. Called before the Assembly's Committee on Indian Affairs at the June Assembly, this is just before Bacon ran fully amok, Kakakoeska stoutly resisted English demands that the Pamunkeys join in attacks against other Indians. Our friend Thomas Matthew was there. Matthew was deeply impressed by Kakakoeska's performance. It began with her clothing. She could have worn English fabrics, as she often did, but instead she dressed as a werewance on a formal state occasion, wearing a crown of black and white beads, symbolizing spiritual and earthly power, and a long deerskin mantle with 6-inch fringes. Matthew could not help but admire her graceful carriage as she entered the chamber with an English interpreter on her left and her son on her right. They walked the length of the room, and she seated herself at the lower end of the table. Kakakoeska's majestic air and grave court-like gestures were wasted on the committee's chairman, who abruptly asked her what men she would lend us for guides in the wilderness and assist us against our enemy Indians. She spoke with what Matthew described as an earnest, passionate countenance, as if tears were ready to gush out in a fervent sort of expression, the torrent of words stumbling out so quickly that the interpreter could not keep up with her. But Matthew was able to make out a little bit of what she said, and with the help of a neighbor who knew the backstory, understood that the last time the Pamunkeys had lent a great deal of military support to the Virginia colony in the 1650s, they had been badly burned and poorly thanked. The chairman continued, "What Indians will you now contribute?" Kakakoeska responded with a disdainful aspect, and turning her head half aside, sat mute. The chairman repeated his question. Finally, that same question being pressed a third time, she repeated with what Matthew called a low, sliding voice in her own language, and with her head still turned away from the Englishman, 6. Kakakoeska sat silently and a little while sullen as the chairman continued badgering her, then spoke again, 12. Then, as an admiring Matthew walked, Kakakoeska rose up and gravely walked away, as not pleased with her treatment. Let's talk about the conduct of the rebellion. I won't inflict a detailed timeline on you, but if I did, you would see that the rebels spent way more time in the field against Native people than they did against Berkeley's loyalists. Bacon insisted all along that his targets were Indians, and that his actions, in fact, bore that out. The volunteers, he promised, would not bear arms against the governor unless he attacked them from the rear while they were out fighting Native people. True to Bacon's word, once he had extorted his military commission from the governor in June, Bacon left Berkeley in control of the government and of Jamestown while he went out to gather volunteers for a campaign against the Susquehannocks. But Berkeley took this opportunity to try to raise forces against the rebels. So Bacon got wind of this, he turned around, drove Berkeley out of the capital, and established a provincial government in Berkeley's absence. In the following months, as we've seen, Loyalists and Baconites traded possession of Jamestown between them, culminating in the rebels' capture and burning of the capital on September 19. But again, it bears repeating that Bacon spent way more time afield against Virginia's native Indians, having given up pretty quickly on tracking down the Susquehannocks, and particularly on finding the Pamunkeys, than he ever did fighting Loyalists. And I think it's significant that he was true to this even to the end of his own life. Remember, the central purpose for Bacon was a general Indian war, and he died in late October on the 27th while campaigning against Indians, not against the governor's forces. The consequences were massive and spread all the way down to the Gulf Coast, and although I won't talk about this much, as far north as New York and New England. For the Susquehannocks and other First Nations, neither Bacon's death nor the arrival of British regular troops to squash the rebellion in January of 1677, nor even Berkeley's death in July 1677 could resolve the issues that for them were at the heart of the conflict, them being Native people. The resolutions, unfortunately, as they unfolded over the next quarter century, came almost at the expense, almost exclusively at the expense of Native people. Neighbor Indians, for example, returned to their homes. A tough new treaty in 1677 reaffirmed their alliance with Virginia, but allowed colonists to continue to chip away at their landholdings and their political influence through a grinding combination of epidemic diseases, squatting on Indian lands, piecemeal land purchases, unpredictable bursts of political violence, and by weaponizing the colonial legal system. Farther afield, which is why I have this slide of the eastern seaboard here, Virginia's involvement in the Indian slave trade quickened as a direct consequence of Bacon's Rebellion. New statutes in Virginia legitimized slavery, Indian slavery, and at the same time, an accelerating cycle of epidemics, warfare, and rivalries between indigenous nations throughout the South swelled the number of captives that were available for sale into slavery within the English colonies. In Virginia, ordinary planters who could not afford the limited number of enslaved Africans that were available from the Atlantic slave trade readily purchased enslaved native people. On the upper James River, between where we're standing and today's Richmond, in the late 17th century, 40% of all enslaved people were Indians, not Africans. Or here's another data point. When a 1680 statute required the counties to register the ages of young slaves for the purposes of taxation, the Henrico County Court recorded 33 Indian children, 33, against no Africans. In other counties, between a third and a half of enslaved youths were Native American. Even those who were listed as servants were required by law to serve terms that were so long that they shaded into slavery. Native people had to serve a minimum of 12 years, or until they turned 30, whichever came later, which was far longer than the terms that were required of white indentured servants. If there was a controversy over whether a Native person had served his or her term that had to be determined in the courts, they were at a handicap because they couldn't testify in those cases. All told, throughout the South, 30 to 50,000 Native people were enslaved by the British between 1670 and 1715. Many individuals were sold to the West Indies, where they disappeared into the maw of some of the most voracious and destructive slave systems in the world. People who have researched this in the islands have found planters' registers of the enslaved people on their plantations, and have found examples where someone is named as an Indian, and then someone else went through, crossed it out, and using the term of the day, wrote in Negro. Back in the mainland South, entire towns and peoples disappeared as a result of this maelstrom of epidemics, warfare, and enslavement. They disappeared, or they were absorbed into more successful nations and confederacies, such as the Creeks and Cherokees, which were really forming at this time period. Gaping holes in the map opened up as places that were once inhabited by numerous small nations became buffer zones between a more limited number of larger and more powerful nations. Okay, now granted, white Virginians also had problems after the rebellion. Many continued to struggle under some combination of heavy taxation, political powerlessness, labor shortages, and other economic problems. And many continued to believe that Indians were in some way responsible for their troubles. Consequently, Virginia's post-rebellion political leaders faced a dilemma. If they levied higher taxes to fund Indian wars, that might spark another rebellion. But if they didn't fight more Indian wars, then that too might spark a rebellion. Most colonists wouldn't be satisfied either way. Which brings me to a third and final story about Bacon's Rebellion, one that encompasses much of eastern North America and northern Europe. The deaths of the governor and the rebel resolved little except their own personal problems. At the end of the rebellion, as the conflict shifted from the field of battle to the political arena, many colonists came to see the stakes that were involved in Virginia's Indian affairs as truly cosmic in scope and significance. Post-rebellion governors tried to compromise with those who had supported Bacon's call for a general Indian war. They did so by allowing colonists to stir up as much trouble as they wanted among distant southern nations, but they also returned to the pre-rebellion strategy of treating the neighbor Indians as allies. A way of proceeding, let me remind you, that imagined a slower and less costly, but ultimately just as complete elimination of Native people. Former rebels and sympathizers only reluctantly acquiesced in this compromise. I like to call them neo-Baconites. Increasingly, post-rebellion neo-Baconites linked their campaign to annihilate all Indians to a great crisis in religious and dynastic affairs that was dominating England's political life during the 1670s and 1680s. When I teach early American history, I have sort of a call and response that I have students participate in every couple of weeks. I say the British colonists were, and the first week that's what they say. By the end of the week, they're all shouting back, the British colonists were British, right? So Virginia and Maryland are very much a part of the political system of what is now Great Britain, just as much as, say, California or Hawaii is part of the United States today. Well, Bacon's rebellion, as it happened, coincided with this crisis, which was a popular and parliamentary movement to prevent King Charles II's brother James, an outed Catholic, from succeeding him as king. Widespread popular unrest in England and in the colonies as well took on an increasingly rabid anti-Catholic tone. And if you can, yeah, sure, that's nice big print, you can read that. It's a little unhinged. Late in 1676, an anonymous colonist, probably Josias Fendall, who had been a thorn in the side of the proprietors of Maryland for many years, penned what was titled A Complaint from Heaven, addressed to the king and others in London. He claimed that even Bacon's analysis of the colonists' problems hadn't gone far enough. Indeed, the rebellion marked only what he called the first act of the late tragedy, referring to the rebellion. Berkeley, it was said, was merely the dupe of a far more sinister figure. Okay? Don't be afraid. Lord Baltimore. The proprietor of Maryland and a powerful Catholic with strong connections to Charles II and his brother James. Baltimore, the author of the complaint charged, had arranged a deadly alliance between the Indians, powerful English Catholics, the French, especially the Jesuits, who had placed missionaries in New France and among the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, in what is today central and western New York, and of course the Pope himself, all joined together in a great conspiracy to destroy English Protestantism. The final and second most frightening links in the plot were those between London and Versailles, between James II, England's king, who was supposed to be the sword of Protestantism, but was in fact a Catholic, and Francis Louis XIV, who was, at that time, really considered to be the sword of Catholicism. Now, I said these were the second most frightening links in the plot, because the theological debate amongst the hotter sort of Protestants at the time ranged from, at one extreme, the Pope is Satan's instrument, Satan's minion, and at the other extreme, the Pope is Satan, right? So that's very concerning. Persistent rumors of this far-flung plot gained momentum throughout the late 1670s and the 1680s, in no small part because the Susquehannock War, far from having been settled during Bacon's rebellion, was actually intensifying. The Susquehannocks had fled to several different places, but the largest groups had fled to Haudenosaunee towns, Iroquois towns, and were sort of, seen to be perched just on the frontiers of Maryland and Virginia. These Susquehannocks, who had taken refuge among the Five Nations, guided Haudenosaunee warriors as they swept down from the north and attacked both neighbor Indians and colonists in Virginia and Maryland. Every one of these raids seemed to confirm the existence of this French Jesuit, Indian, English Catholic, satanic conspiracy. Colonists, moreover, found no difficulty in believing that their neighbor Indians, too, were secretly in on the plot, despite the fact that these northern raids more often targeted the Piscataways or the Pamunkeys or other neighbor Indians rather than colonists. The waves of paranoid rumors came ever closer throughout the 1680s. In the spring of 1689, for example, Virginia's counselors discussed how to respond to reports that they, the counselors, were, again, don't be afraid, papists. The people were saying that, as far as the counselors had heard, the people were saying that Catholics had, quote, hired the Indians to cut off all the Protestants. 10,000 Haudenosaunee warriors and 9,000 from the eastern shore were massing for an attack. panicked Virginians began, this is the council records, drawing themselves into parties with force of arms. And I should point out the force of arms, very recently, in a similar situation, had been directed against the council as well as against Native people. I should also point out that at this time, there weren't 10,000 Haudenosaunee warriors at the headwaters of the Potomac where they were said to be. I mean, above today's Washington, D.C. There were probably just under 10,000 Haudenosaunee people in the world. And so it's unlikely that 110% of them marched down, were all men, and undetected, except through these rumors, were waiting to fall upon the colonists. Eastern Shore Indians, also not 9,000 strong at the time. So what finally resolved the tensions that had driven Bacon's rebellion and that through the 1680s had motivated unrepentant Baconites and led to this continuation of the violence of Bacon's rebellion? Well, in a nutshell, England's Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689. The Glorious Revolution was a signal event in English history. It ousted the Catholic King James II, because a trigger here being that his wife had recently produced their first male and Catholic heir. The Glorious Revolution replaced James II with his oldest daughter by his first Protestant wife, and with her fiercely Protestant Dutch husband, which gave us William and Mary. Colonists throughout America, including in Virginia and Maryland, and then followed up by capturing their provincial governments in the name of William, Mary, and Protestantism. The Glorious Revolution, not the deaths of the governor or the rebel, marked the culmination of Bacon's rebellion. First, because it eliminated Catholics from positions of power. And second, because William and Mary appointed a series of governors who understood that it was their job to drive away the neighbor Indians or reduce them to postage stamp reservations. After the Glorious Revolution, governors such as Francis Nicholson realized that it was not their job to enter into treaties with or otherwise coddle, as it was said, Native people. In other words, the Baconites lost the rebellion but won the war over policy. A sharp increase in the availability of enslaved Indians and Africans after the Glorious Revolution in the 1690s, moreover, coincided with a decrease in white immigration and an increase in the white population's natural birth rate. So it's demographics, right? The result was a tighter web of familial and other relationships among whites, and a greater sense of common identity among whites, which reinforced the drawing of ever sharper dividing lines between slavery and freedom and between races. Okay, so there you have it. 3 sketches drawn on progressively larger canvases, ranging from the local to the transatlantic. I hope that these tales held some surprises for you, and that they left you with some questions. I believe we have plenty of time for those. And finally, I hope that you'll tune in for the full slate of Preservation Virginia's programs on Bacon's Rebellion between now and October. If you do, you'll learn much more about women in Bacon's Rebellion, about class and racial justice, about indigenous history, about the archaeology of Bacon's Rebellion, the burning of Jamestown, and about a key site in the rebellion, Bacon's Castle in Surry County. Thank you. Okay, so I'm sure we do have time for questions. I'm not sure how much time there is. Elise, how much time do we have? Okay, how much time do we have, though? Oh, geez, okay. John Erickson?
Yeah, I was thinking for the commissioners that come in 77, they seem very sympathetic towards rebels, and that seems to fly in the face of typical English ideals of authority and order. Why do you think they seem to, in some ways, scapegoat on Berkeley and have some sympathy for rebels?
I think that might have been a bit of an accident. Bacon had taken over, I think it's 20 different planters, loyalist planters' homes during the rebellion, and most of them were pretty trashed. And when these gentlemen came from England, they couldn't stay with a loyalist host, and so they stayed with a Baconite host and sat around his table for weeks at a time. And I suspect that planter actually kind of controlled the narrative for them. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, I wonder why he didn't hang more of them. I mean, this is rank rebellion, and I know I sound like such a Tory, but I'm not a fan of this Bacon fellow. He's just such a narcissist. But he didn't necessarily know what the royal crown's reaction would be, or when it would come. The first hangings were at a pretty precarious moment in the Civil War part of this, not the war against Native people. And I think it was necessary, he felt it was necessary to draw some examples right away. And I think a lot of these hangings were exemplary. I mean, one of them was at West Point, and the fellow wasn't hanged. He was gibbeted and left to starve and die of thirst and then be left hanging in chains. So I think it was exemplary, and also because, hey, he's the governor. He's the head of the court system. No, it's not because he can do what he wants, but this is a crime against the provincial government that is typically punished, actually much more savagely than with mere hanging. So do we have time for one more question? Okay, I saw a hand over here. Yeah.
So what is it about Mr. Matthews that
He believed in magic, for one thing. I think 4 different points he attributes events to some divine intervention. There's, I think it's a Susquehannock or a Doeg boy who was revived through with the help of the Book of Common Prayer. He thinks that for a very, very long time, I stayed away from this story because there's going to be a great program on the Dragon Swamp, where the Pamunkeys and others took refuge and really ran the legs off the rebels. And the rebels had a hard time because they didn't know where they were going, and the Pamunkeys knew exactly what they were doing, but also because it kept raining. And Matthew imagined this cloud following the rebels around wherever they went, but inflicting, while the powwowings of the Indians, as he called it, conjured up drought elsewhere in Virginia. That's one reason. But he's just, I don't know, he's like a Zelig figure, or what is it, the Tom Hanks movie? Forrest Gump figure. He just turns up everywhere in the story. Like at one point he's here in Jamestown, and he's like so glad he was elected to this big June assembly, and he just really wants to go home and get out of harm's way. And he's like eating his meal, minding his own business, late afternoon, and Nathaniel Bacon walks up to him and he says, "I hear you have good handwriting." And I don't know what a bad word would have been in Matthew's head at the time, but I'm sure he thought it, because Bacon made him sign a bunch of commissions for officers for Bacon's volunteers that Bacon had just extorted at gunpoint from the governor. And Bacon's like, Matthew was just like, I didn't really feel like I had a choice. He's standing over me. I had to go. But then he goes back up to the Potomac, and he's asked to take a commission in the volunteers, and he's like, no, I got all this tobacco and hogs and everything. And so he's everywhere as a reluctant participant in just about everything, and he just writes very charmingly. Yeah. Okay. There are a couple. I think with the black shirt, I think you were faster off the mark. Yeah. I don't know. I've never thought about that. Is it okay to say that? Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that. Sorry. It's, yeah. Yeah. Elise, who's next? Yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of the rebels kind of suspected that the Catholic plots and papists and on the council, were any of them actually Catholic at all? Or like the other Catholic or anything?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Some of them were, yes, especially on the Northern Neck. And they had to try extra hard to prove that they weren't. Yeah. I mean, can I shoehorn this in? Because there's not a lot of sex in this story. But to the extent that there is, it goes to Charles II. An issue here is that he didn't have any heirs by the Queen, but he had something like 14 or 18 by other women. And one of them, the Duke of Monmouth, came to be the one of these, illegitimate children who English Protestants fastened their hopes on. And there was actually an uprising. He rode over, he sailed over from the Netherlands and tried to overthrow. I guess by that time, James II, I guess, by that time? I can't remember. But the rebellion failed. But there were people in Virginia and Maryland who were clearly rooting for both sides. There were certainly people who were rooting for Monmouth, a Protestant, who would overthrow a Catholic. But there were also people who dreaded this result because they felt that it would crush Catholicism, particularly in the Northern Neck and in Maryland. Okay, thanks everyone for coming out.